Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Differentiate Understanding. Joining me today is Chim Lee. Chim works in EIU Economist Intelligence Unit's China and Asia teams and is based in the company's Beijing and Hong Kong offices. He leads EIU's research on China's advanced technologies, climate change, energy, semiconductors, and AI, and also covers how China's industrial policies link up with the broader diplomatic and macroeconomic dynamics. Prior to joining the EIU in 2022, Chim led the energy, technology, and innovation teams at the advisory company China Policy. Hey Chim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Chim, you're with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and this is something that's not really too consumer facing, more to B, right? But it has a
Mhm.
relationship with the Economist magazine. Could you tell us a bit about the organization, and more importantly, what is it that you do there, your coverage, your expertise, and your experience?
Yeah, of course. So the way I tend to describe it is that if you think about the Economist magazine as a subscription for the public, I think the Economist Intelligence Unit, is a subscription for the private sector or institutional decision makers. So we tend to forecast and model each country's, in the world's their trajectory politically, economically. So anything from how fast GDP is going to grow in China to like election outcome in Thailand and Japan to like what China's AI investment means for the economic life. So all these sort of things we do analysis and forecasting and modeling. So as for myself, I tend to look at China a bit more. So particularly in terms of how China's technology landscape evolves, energy landscape evolves, and in turn how it's linked up with like domestic context and the economic context, but also like geopolitically, what does it mean for the world?
Yeah, and I think on that note, the biggest kind of backdrop that we should probably address today is the 5-year plan announcement or the proposal for the next 5-year plan. To start off with just some context for everyone, the Central Committee of China's ruling Communist Party has officially announced its proposal for the 15th 5-year plan. So this is a 15th 5-year plan. And this is the nation's grand plan announced every 5 years to convey its political economic priorities to society. And the impact is not usually just on the domestic businesses, policies in society, and even how the future of like innovation and like kind of technological entrepreneurship goes towards, but it also has implications for economies and, like you said, diplomacy around the world. So I think let's start big today. Tell us about what even is this? What is the news? Why is it so important? And start with why it's important for China and its new and changes. Then let's go into why it's important for the rest of the world.
Yeah. So I think we can start with like a little bit of headline takeaways. And I think in the interest of time, probably share just three things I found quite helpful for the audience. I think the very first thing is sort of know what it means to have a 5-year plan. This is not something that I think people in the West tend to understand, but I think these sort of plans in the Chinese governance system is very important for signaling. So these sort of plans is not just drafted by center. So what we have seen is a proposal over the next 5-year plan. And over the next few months, we'll see everyone important in every ministry, in every central state enterprises, and some of the private enterprises as well. They will be involved in, or at least advising the government in drafting the actual 5-year plan, which will be released in early 2026. And this is really to outline sort of where China think it is currently, and also where China wants the country to be at, like over the next 5 years. So a lot of the things that was said this last week is really to actually they will be put into actionable items and goals that we'll see coming out in early 2026. So I think this is very important for like signaling to the public in China where China is trying to focus at. So that's the very first thing. And I think the second takeaway there, given from what we can see from this latest proposal compared to the previous 5-year plan proposals, I think one thing that really stood out to me is just the very stern language on very result-oriented approach to science and technology and innovation. So I think one of the biggest differences there is really to feel that the policymakers feel that they need to sort of break the technological choke points. So where China remains very dependent on foreign supply. So I think the wordings are quite interesting in this context, where they say that they will take extraordinary measures to achieve quote unquote decisive progress in areas like semiconductors, in software, and advanced materials. And these are all areas where, if you look at China's import basket, both in terms of products and also services, those are very much dependent on imports. And I think even beyond these areas, we can see the language suggests more result-oriented approach to other things as well. There is an implied logic there where science and technology and their developments should be serving industrial development and also other sort of state objectives as well. And I think one final takeaway there is how China absolutely wants to maintain its edge in manufacturing. So in the context of how we have seen a lot of discussions around industrial policy around the world these days, there is a very interesting estimate coming from the IMF recently, saying that China actually spent about 4% to 5% of its GDP on industrial policy. So we don't really see that changing over the next 5 years. And I think there's a very strong sense from China that they see a value in maintaining the manufacturing sector, in to a certain extent, even a little bit of redundancy as well, as we've seen recently in China's overcapacity problem. So as compared that to the risk of industrial hollowing out, this is sort of the lesser of two evils in some ways. So I think all of this is really looking at how China is seeing itself in terms of technology, innovation, and also industrial policy. We start to see very strong signals coming out for the next, to sort of where China's heading for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think we definitely want to double click on the overcapacity involution conversation later. But I just want to kind of go back to your comment on the focus on science, technology, and really there's a lot of, I guess, headlines per se on the focus on self-reliance in technology. I think I found a quote here that the government will continue channeling resources towards strategic emerging industries such as AI, new energy, new materials, advancing manufacturing, and future industries like brain-computer interfaces. On that particular kind of phrasing, is that something that's changed over the years, or is that quite similar to China's previous 5-year plan?
Yeah, it is very interesting to see sort of actually how language evolved over the last decade or two. So technological self-reliance, this is definitely not new in the Chinese context. If you go back way back to the People's Republic's founding, we have seen how those languages appear very early on. And in those times, of course, it's a bit different. We're talking about military technology mostly. And then I think what has changed over the last few decades is that we have seen over time, science and technology was assigned more of a role of economic development. So I think particularly in the 90s and 2000s, the emphasis there is okay, so whatever technology and innovation you can find. So whether it is absorbing foreign technology or actually integrating different kinds of technologies or actually our original innovation, it doesn't matter as to sort of the approach, as long as they are serving economic development goals. I think what we've seen here is that logic has sort of shifted back a little bit. So of course, we're not just talking about military technology. It's a very different times compared to the 50s and 60s and 70s. But we are looking at how the emphasis of self-reliance is quite critical in today's world when we're talking about, a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, a lot of tensions with the West. So from Chinese policymakers' angles, they're really looking at it from that, we really need to actually ramp this up. Don't get me wrong. So I think from the language, we actually can see that China is actually quite satisfied with the progress that they have seen over the last decade or so. We've seen China making a lot of technological breakthroughs, but I think from the policymakers' angle, they're also seeing it as that, we need to particularly focus on areas that we still have these choke points.
Yeah. And how does this actually relate to the global economy? Why is this such a big deal, this policy, this proposal?
Yeah, I tend to look at it from the trade flow and investment flow angle. I think we can look at it from how, I would say it would affect, first of all, the global trade flow, right? So when we talk about China very much still emphasizing manufacturing, that means that, when we talk about overcapacity problems, these are not necessarily problems that we will see very dramatic solutions, so to speak. So a gradual approach means that a lot of the discussions around China's lower export prices and competitiveness globally, I think that is still going to be a very major topic over the next few years. Even lower, I think, like in terms of like Chinese products competition, not just in the West, but also in some emerging markets as well. And then I think we're also looking at global trade in technology and energy as well. So I think on the flip side, while we see like more Chinese exports in terms of like sort of manufactured goods, but we're also looking perhaps like sort of reduce imports when it comes to like advanced technology products, where China would like to see utilization of more of its own production. So I think in this context, we have already seen discussions coming out from NVIDIA saying how their market share has plunged. And
Yeah.
these sort of dynamics will be a major theme for the next few years too. And I think one area that people tend to overlook as well is also global trade in energy. So the plan itself did actually mention like China plans to peak its oil consumption over the next 5 years. This is not something new. I think a lot of the market forecasters have been saying that. But it also points to like how China is also thinking about, in terms of hydrocarbon imports, like how it's trying to cut it back. And at the same time, China is actually exporting a lot of the new energy products, right? So we talk about EVs and solars and wind turbines and batteries. Like these are all very critical for everyone's energy transition. So I think in this context, like we see the sort of trade flows like very much like reorganizing.
Right. So I think quite a few of the critical sectors you just mentioned, like EVs, renewables, technology, these are essentially continue to be the sectors that the Chinese government will put critical resources into. But what we're seeing is something you mentioned as well is the overcapacity issue, right? Right now, we're seeing, a lot of the private players are creating a price war domestically. They're really heavily reliant on the export right now. But if there is continued export constraints to certain sectors, such as the EV sector, they have to find the demand domestically. And that's been an issue, right? What we're seeing is, the insane domestic price war is driving out a lot of the players to shut down or go bankrupt. And essentially, local governments have to clean them up. And this leads me to the next topic, which is essentially the rise of the term involution. Everyone's talking about it, 内卷. I think from my parenting, like group chats, everyone's talking about 内卷 with education, to, like these business conversations, everyone's talking about the 内卷 of, again, the EV sector, energy sector, even AI, right? So EIU just recently released a 7-part series in China's overcapacity issue. And you basically cover everything we just talked about, all these different sectors. You break them down. Can you actually tell us what is the main issue with involution right now? And then we'll go deeper into your 7-part series, especially focusing on EV sector and the energy sector.
Yeah, I think involution comes from a very interesting social context, right? I think like initially it was very much describing like, oh, like if you are leaving work at like 5 p.m., then I should leave work 6 p.m. just to show that my boss, that I'm working very well. And so these sort of have been put into like the industrial sector, and in terms of like how across a lot of the sectors we actually see like very destructive competition behaviors. So I think in terms of like the statistics, we are thinking about like profit margin shrinking very significantly. In fact, if you look at China's manufacturing sector, the profit margin has been some of the lowest points like since around 2000. And I think we are and also looking at the same time, we're also looking at like producer prices, plunging as well. So we have seen, so this is really, as you said, like the manifestation of the price war we saw over quite a lot of sectors. But I think like if we take a step back to think about all of this, it is really sort of it is somewhat by design at a very high level in China. So what we tend to see over a lot of different sectors is that demand can shoot up. So and this could be due to like market or policy reasons in particular sector. So take EV for example. Like so in the 2000s, we have seen like very strong signals like, okay, China wants to develop an EV sector. Then you see that, and given China's market size, like it's very easy and very natural for anyone who is interested in this sector to think like, oh well, there's such a huge market there, then I should think about investing in it. So then you see like lots of speculative behaviors, a lot of investment from proper investors as well, from those who are actually involved in the automotive sector or the battery sector to think about investing in it. And then once you see that like spectacular growth in terms of supply, over time, what you tend to see is that you do have a lot of players that are actually not particularly good. They probably joined because of a speculative wave. And then that is where you see that overcapacity problem coming in. And I think given China, the size of China's economy and size of China's industrial sector, we tend to see like these problems played out in a very dramatic manner, right? I think we have seen that play out many times in the past. So if you took a look at the 2000s, we have seen the home appliance sector being one major area and pushing a lot of like Korean or other Asian, marketplace out. And then I think, in 2010s, we have seen a wave of like solar overcapacity already. But I think what makes it really different this time is that China's manufacturing sector has grown so much and it is affecting such a large number of sectors that it's politically and economically painful for both China and its trading partners as well. So I think it is in this context where we see a major difference emerging.
And how is the government actually like dealing with this issue then? Like, because surely you did mention like part of it, the initial start of the evolution was top-down plan in some perspective. They wanted a competition, they wanted more competitive players in the market, but now that's gone overboard. What do we do now? Are we going to see another crackdown on certain
Mm.
sectors, or what is the right way to go forward, I guess, to help these companies?
Yeah, so I think we can think about this in a few ways, right? So of course you can have like a shock therapy. So I think that is what happened in the mid 2010s when the so-called supply side reform. We've seen like a massive scale down in terms of like the steel production capacity or coal sector's production capacity. I think like quite quickly after that, within 1 year or two, you see like profit margin improving. We see like production in a much healthier manner. Pollution also gone down as well. But then we don't really quite see that happening this time. And rather, we tend to see like a more gradual approach to the things. And so at least our baseline view is that based on our assessment of like a wide range of different sectors, we feel that the consolidation process is going to take quite a while. So it is already happening. This
Yeah.
restructuring and this consolidation is happening, but it's going to extend well into 2026, if not beyond. And I think the government's role here is that you cannot really expect the government to intervene in every single sector in a very one size fits all manner, right? So we talk about sectors like EVs and solar and steel and coal and all these, like they all have very different dynamics and they all have somewhat different mechanisms that make them very prone to overcapacity. And so the way to address them will be very different. And so what we tend to see the central government doing is to see, okay, what are some of the steps that we can take for like on a holistic level. So for example, like we've seen amendments on the pricing laws, trying to like reduce the power of some of the monopoly players, like in certain supply chains. For
Hmm.
example, in the automotive supply chain, they want to make sure the automakers don't go against their suppliers too much. But I think outside of like this sort of very holistic approach, like I think individual sectors, like in a certain way, they would need to work themselves out compared to like the past where we see like very dramatic measures of like government ordained like shutdowns of like capacity. So yeah, it is going to be quite painful, unfortunately.
I actually think it's really interesting you bring up the coal energy source kind of regulation back then. I think because when you look back at it, the government really steps in a lot more aggressively when it really affects the public health or the big public well-being versus the current sectors we're looking at. In many ways, it's actually like a still consumer-facing issue with EVs and whatnot. So it's not really like a public well-being issue right now, and not like the education sector either, right? So actually, what we've been talking about is that there's been this an invisible hand, but there's also this visible hand that really kind of tugs and tweaks China's economy. How do we understand China's government role in this economic planning, and how I guess policies work with or work to regulate the private sector?
Yeah, I think to start with is that we have to understand China has an enormous visible invisible hand mechanism there, right? So when we talk about sectors like solar and batteries and EVs too, yeah, the leading players are all like private companies, and
Hmm.
they are not like, at least not in the traditional sense, what we would call state-owned enterprises. So a lot of this innovation and technology, they really come from the private sector. Um, what we tend to see the government's role here is that I think depends on sector, but I think for sectors where you do see very strong private presence, what we tend to see is that the government would adjust the levers to make to sort of at a different stage of development. So at the very beginning, if we're talking about a very nascent industry, then of course you actually need you would like to have support for like on both the supply side and the demand side, right? So on the supply side, the government is really involved in like, okay, maybe we can lower the entry barriers. So for example, like we can invest more in the technology development so that like we can help entrepreneurs to actually take advantage of these technologies to roll them out quicker. And then we can also think about like, oh, how can we actually invest in those companies? So we have seen like several investment vehicles and also debt instruments, designed for entrepreneurs. On the demand side, then we can also see like, okay, so in the EV sector, we have purchase subsidies, we have like lower tax. Consumption tax for value added tax for automotives and whatnot. So I think in that context, like we have seen how the government is involved in actually sort of reducing the barriers of like this market, like maturing. But at the same time, like once we got to a stage where what we see today, when it comes to like, okay, the sector is at a stage where we would like to see consolidation, but not too disruptive, but we do want to see like gradual consolidation. Then we can also see the government reversing some of these approaches, right? So I think in the solar sector, we have already seen like some of the financing access has been scaled back. So it's not as easy for like a solar company to list on the stock market compared to before. We have seen how the regulations in terms of like building up new steel mills like that has been tightened. So it's not very easy for anyone involved to actually build one necessarily. So in this context, like we can see these mechanisms being adjusted to fit what the market needs, and also what, at least in the government's view, like what the market needs.
Mm-hmm. I think it's something you touched on from the very beginning, which is like you said, these innovative companies are actually not SOEs. And I think this is something that a lot of Western investors sometimes don't fully understand. And I get the question a lot, which it's always like, okay, if this is part of a strategic industry, if this is deemed as strategic by the government, they must be backed by the government. What does it mean to be a private, what does it mean to be receiving strategic support but not be a SOE? And this is the part where like I think the West just thinks China is either run by government and private sector like is so small and just mom and pop shops from selling coffee or whatnot, right? There's to understand that all strategic level businesses are basically government control, and that's just not the case. So I think I want to throw it back to you. The question is just like, how do we understand strategic industries, and when we talk about they're being strategically supported by the government, what does it mean? Then I want to ask, what is the dynamic between these private sector players and public sector players within these same industries?
Yeah, I think this really depends on the industry we tend to be talking about, right? So for sectors where you see is a very beginning of like of sort of the technology development cycle, so technologies that are very far away from commercialization, then you will see like much stronger state involvement. And in this context, often not even state-owned enterprises. We're talking about universities, we're talking about research institutions in China, and they do receive a lot of fundings. Just from the government in many ways similar to what in the West you will see from public research organizations and university receiving funding from respective governments. So we see so this is where we see some of the similar technologies that China developed in the past, like that sort of came out of those too. And then when we talk about like sort of technologies closer to commercialization, so I think over the last few decades, that would be batteries, that would be or EVs, like then we are seeing like very different set of incentives like put into place. So we mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of like how China would put in supply and demand measures to actually facilitate the development of the market. And I think in this context, like then we can see where in a given sector whether we do see stronger private sort of involvement or public sector involvement. So I think for some of the sort of legacy industries, so particularly in say automotive, that you do have like a very, very strong presence of the state sector. And I think that really influenced like actually how the sector has been evolving over the last few decades. And in turn, like that also really affects like market entry and exit mechanisms. But like we do see like in several sectors where the the private sector is really the main driver. Like the solar sector is a very prime example of that. And I think when you look at many of like China's consumer electronics sectors and consumer electronics like players, and also in terms of like areas that are looking more into export-oriented sectors, I think these are all areas where you see very, very strong private presence. And I think from the government perspective, like if you bring it back to like how they work together, we do see, I think the government is trying to move towards a model where there can be more collaboration. So I think I was reading some of the research coming from, I believe, UC San Diego, coming from Professor Barry Norton, and his team was describing this sort of whole of nation approach. So like often like it comes in a consortium structure. So in a certain way you can see like a particular, like a government set a particular target, right? So, we want to develop this technology, and then let's just assemble the best team for that, right? So it can be state-owned enterprises, can be universities, it can be private sector. So this consortium will be involved in like from the very beginning in terms of like how to actually conduct research in that technology, to like how to actually manifest its commercialization or usage in a broader society. And so these are some of the dynamics we see emerging as well when it comes to like how the public and private sector can work together to some extent.
It's really a good explanation of how that works, because I think people just kind of misunderstand and assumes that whenever an industry is deemed strategic, the state just backs all the companies, or all the companies are state drivers. So I think on the topic of strategic industries, let's talk about AI and data centers, because right now that is the hottest topic, right? And I think in the case of China, actually, there are state players in the data center space and they are private players. So right now, are you seeing like data center? First of all, let's go a step back. Who are the major players in data center build out, and what are the kind of choke points they have right now? Is it kind of similar to what U.S. companies are facing, which is like land permits, energy, or is China kind of facing a different kind of set of issues or challenges with data center build out?
Yeah, we see quite a wide range of actors involved in the data center space. So historically, we have seen very big like telecom players in China. So China's telecom sector is dominated by three players, and state-owned players. So they have been heavily involved in this space simply by because of the fact that they are the one in the telecom space. But I think over the last few decades, gradually we have seen in terms of these sort of data and telecom and internet spaces, that we see a huge growth of like private sector involvement as well, right? So Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent, like these are some of the biggest players when it comes to data centers, and largely because they have a huge business when it comes to the tech industry, and a lot of that is consumer facing and business facing, and where like they do need a lot of data centers to process them. And then gradually you also see like involvement from like other players as well. So Huawei being one example there. And then at the same time, like across different parts of the supply chain, like you see contractors, you see like chip suppliers, and then going further downstream, like in terms of like system solutions, like how can we actually integrate all the systems together. So we see quite a wide range of actors like being involved in this. Though of course, like the most visible things are like we're looking at like the investments, right? So like this actual built up. So the money involved in that is quite significant. So I think these are some of the actors that we see involving. I think one final one I would add, which is not like enterprise players, would be all both the central government and local government. So I think this is seen by a lot of government entities as like an investment, right? So I think a very important part is like how does it actually contribute to, like, for example, local economic output, in terms of like how does it account, like, how can actually facilitate like some of the digitization within the local economy, that sort of thing. So I think we see a whole ecosystem of actors being involved in that.
Yeah, and I think on that note, we worked on a piece together. I helped you with some research on the East Data, West Compute piece for EIU earlier this year. And what was fascinating to learn was that, like you mentioned, there's these top-down kind of mandates per se, or incentives, but then there's also very localized like mandates from local governments to build up data centers and to optimize what they have. So in areas where they have more people, they have more ability to provide the compute bit, and for areas where they have more land and more people scarce, they might provide the space and the actual land resource to build up the data centers. And so on that note, why don't you tell us a bit about EDWC, which is East Data West Compute? Like, what is this, and how does it all work together from a government top level to the provincial level?
Yeah, it is a very interesting move because I think this is like way before, all the recent AI wave, right? So like
Hmm.
we've seen this initiative like being rolled out over the last few years, in fact. And so in this context, like what we have seen is that from the government's angle, there is a very strong imbalance. So I think for the audience who are not necessarily very familiar with China's geography, everything, China's the most developed parts of China are on the east coast of the country, right? So like this is where you have Shanghai, Beijing, you have like Shenzhen, and they are very densely populated. Whereas like if you look at the western part of China, they are very scarcely populated. They're very mountainous. The weather is a lot cooler, and so from the government's angle, like from a high level economic side of things, you are already looking at a very huge imbalance in terms of like how the east is always have much richer than the western part of China. And so at the same time, they also see this sort of resource differences, right? So the eastern part of China is very constrained in terms of land, in terms of like they need to, and at the same time, like they just don't have like that capabilities to have like massive build out of energy facilities where it can support these data centers. Whereas on the western part of China, we have seen how some of these, there's much more land available, and at the same time, like given the terrain of the region is actually easy, not that hard to build out renewables. There's actually quite strong renewables um, potential over there. In fact, actually, China has been building up it massively already. So it is in this context where China does see like a possibility where you can actually move some of these like massive data centers to the Western Front, and sort of to alleviate like some of the capacity constraints that you can see on the eastern side of China. So I think this is largely what we've seen played out over the last 5 years or so. Is not without challenges. I think like when we think about how these sort of built out, like you'll still have very much have to think about market supply and demand, right? And you don't want your web search results to actually be like have very long latency. So in this context, like there has been some concerns around like, okay, whether this build out in the western part of China would actually be a good idea. But I think over time we do see like how some of the incentive mechanisms like China, the government has set up, gradually promote like a rational build out of these things as well. And I think especially in the context of AI, now that we see like a massive need for data centers, then I think then like the risk of that overcapacity has come down a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see how all the engineering of different parts of the economy, different demands all come together because there's such centralized kind of overview of the whole economy versus when it's completely private market driven. Sometimes you have, different sectors grow at different pace and it can't meet at the middle. And that's what we're seeing right now in the US where there's AI boom, there's data center demand, there's not enough energy supply, there's not enough, like land license out. So it's really interesting how China has kind of had this slow engineering in the background for years, and that's how they can kind of sage the appetite right now. Um, I think on this, let's kind of double click on and zoom in on the future planning and innovation, right? We talked about how China's kind of an engineering state, and it's been planning a lot of different moving parts for many years. That's how right now it's all coming together. Um, with AI, do we see this as like a new strategic sector, or is this kind of years of planning coming together?
Yeah, I think like this is a very interesting part where China certainly has been planning a lot of the investment in well, not just in AI really, like you talk about STEM more generally. We've seen the education system like has emphasized that, I think, especially over the last decade, and AI has been mentioned like numerous times over the last decades policy documents as well. So that there has always been like this sort of evolving relationship between sort of what China thinks should be developed versus like what starts to come into the horizon. So I think AI is one of these technologies where like it was already something that the country was quite aware of, I think very early on. And then I think as we see developments coming out from the West, then like China said like, okay, so we might want to think about that and how we can actually putting it into China as well. So I think if you look at the plan that came out a few days ago, like there is a very strong emphasis on both on the upstream research part of like theories and in terms of like the models, and then in terms of and also in terms of the downstream part in terms of applications. I think we're at a very early stage in terms of like how AI is deployed, right? So I think the government's attitude right now is really like, let's just try it out. Let's just see what can be done. So we've seen a lot of interesting applications already, and I think like quite a few of your guests already discussed some of those too. And here's where we see like I think we're at a stage where China is not necessarily very concerned about potential overcapacity in the AI space compared to say like other sectors. I think like it is currently at a very early stage where it's allowing everyone to experiment a little bit to see what is actually possible. I think the government has set a few red lines, like for example, in terms of like how it has to be compatible with certain regulations, particularly in terms of data and privacy, and also in terms of like China's governance philosophy and these sort of things. So I think in this context, like we seeing quite a permissive attitude in terms of like how it is being rolled out.
And like you mentioned, there were a lot of speculative players during the EV era. Do you think right now there's a lot of players that are kind of just joining the crowd to kind of try to get luck with a pot of gold, or it's just too early to tell?
Yeah, well, I think like the bubble question is something that we've seen sort of everywhere, right? Definitely not just in China. Unfortunately, this is sort of like a necessary byproduct, I suppose. Like whenever you have a technology that is very with very strong potential, then you certainly would have speculative behavior. And I think like this is a process where China, again, I think for the time being, is all right with it. Once you got into the territory of like the misallocation of resources or corruption, then is where it gets like then China will be paying a bit more attention to that. So we have seen in the past as like in many times some where some of the enterprises like they could be involved in like involved in like certain strategic sectors, and they have been implicated in corruption scandals and whatnot, and China would be cracking down on those. So I think these sort of
Mm-hmm.
things will happen as well. um, but I think like for the time being, what we tend to see is that how China is trying to make sure that, okay, even if we do have overcapacity problems, like in certain areas, let us just make sure that they will be beneficial for the economy in the long run, right? So for example, like, there is a lot of investment going into AI chips. Like how can we actually think about like, okay, even if like turns out the market is not as great as we thought, then like at the very least we can think about like, okay, all of these people that are involved in developing AI chips, like can it work on some other things, right? So there is, I think, like this is not necessarily very like evident in the plans, but I think there's a subtle attitude in terms of like this is all part of like a much broader set of technologies that can change China and change like how China's economy evolves. So I think this sort of coordination is happening too.
Yeah, and I think on the topic of, how AI is driving the future of the economy and how it's becoming a huge growth driver of the economy, I wrote about this thesis, which is like, how Shenzhen, GBA area, Shenzhen, Guangdong, and then like Hong Kong has heavily relied on just their manufacturing capabilities, and that's why they've been able to lead in a lot of the embodied AI products, like from as early as like the DJIs and the Sense Times of the world, right? So I think for you, my question is that, you cover China's technology, you cover the EV sector, you cover the renewable sector. All of this is very heavily reliant on, again, the manufacturing capabilities and the hardware capabilities that China has kind of gained from the last 4 decades, essentially being the manufacturing hub of the world. Right now, with the AI side of technological breakthrough, it's very, very much focused on the essentially the software side of things, right? Well, not software, but the technological model frontier. If you can build the best model, you can integrate into your product, you can maybe potentially have the best embodied AI. So going forward, what is, I guess, your prediction? Do you think China will still be more dominant or leading in hardware breakthrough, software hardware integration? Or do you think it actually we're seeing more and more of a breakthrough in the software side or the application side or language model side or whatnot?
Yeah, I think it is a very interesting question because I think like when we think about indeed like there has been a very strong emphasis on the manufacturing sector, right? So I think I think we mentioned at the very beginning where China is very much like emphasizing that there needs to be an industrial sector. Like this is very important to China's like long-term economic well-being. So there will always be sort of this emphasis on like the manufacturing side, and by extension, of course, like manufactured products, technological products, hardwares, and so on and so forth. I think on the software side, it has always been a very interesting part of things. So on one hand, we have seen like very interesting innovation coming out of China, right? So if you look at like mobile payment systems, like, a lot of these consumer-facing applications, like, and these are not even just happening within China at this point. Like a lot of these players are now like very involved in like these applications developed in all the emerging markets, like go down to Southeast Asia or go into Latin America. You see very strong expansion of some, or at least like very similar model when it comes to how they work. But I think what China is trying to do when in software space is really thinking about like the industrial software and what you said earlier about like AI models. These sort of areas where the West has a very strong dominance. Like in certain ways, it's related to technological capacity, but also related to network effect as well. So I think one of the major things that China has highlighted in the 15th Five-Year Plan proposal is that it needs to break the choke points on foundational software. So I think
Mm-hmm.
over the next few years, we will see quite a strong. I think we'll see quite a strong push. I think again, both on the supply side and the demand side. So in terms of like how to actually improve the supply of these technologies to make sure that they are actually as good, if not better, than like their foreign counterparts. And on the demand side, like how can the government promote their use, not just in the public sector, but also potentially in the private sector as well. So I think these are some of the things that we might tend to see, and I think over the next few years, yeah, I think I do feel that like there's still going to be very strong emphasis on hardware, but I think software is certainly an area that China is definitely not missing it.
Thank you. I think we're gonna go into the last bit of our interview, which is, what is something that you think people are actually missing or misunderstanding? You've been really covering this space for well over a decade, really, like before, even as a policy analyst. What are people kind of getting wrong about the big picture on China's economic planning and development?
Yeah, I think when we think about China, one of the lessons I've learned very much is never underestimate Chinese policymakers and entrepreneurs, really. They're very agile. They're very, very agile. So we have seen how when it comes to the export controls imposed on, let's say, Huawei, we have seen how it has bounced back from and try to focus on areas where it still finds advantages. And then we have seen how DeepSeek is a very notable example there, right? Working with all of these constraints, like when it comes to hardware, and try to work out a model that it would work in a Chinese context. And these are just the entrepreneurial side of things. I think policymakers as well, like they are quite adaptable. Like when they see that, okay, the situation, so some of the problems are of course like very difficult. Energy transition is a huge problem, is a huge challenge for everyone. And how China is doing, and it's all very gradual as a process, but that doesn't mean that China is completely unable to do any of those things. So I think that is one of the major lessons I would say out there, and and I think in the medium term, what we tend to see is that, in terms of technology innovation space, like in the 15th Five-Year Plan, we are also seeing like the mentioning of like high tech talent immigration scheme. Well, not an immigration scheme, but a visa scheme. So in this context, it's actively also attracting foreign talent.
Yeah.
And this is quite a change when you think about China's like political economy. It has rarely emphasized like the of course, like it will welcome overseas Chinese returnees, but I think in general, like when it comes to like foreign talent, it has been quite careful when it comes to approaching that topic. So I think like we are starting to see like also in terms of like how China's international cooperation is changing as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting takeaway. I think China's definitely shown like a really big shift in their way approach to foreign talent, because I remember when I was trying to work in China, or when I did work in China, it was really difficult to actually obtain a visa, right? You have to have had at least 2 years of work experience abroad or anywhere else, not China. You have to had if you had obtained a higher degree in China, you get bonus points. And there was this ranking system of like class A, class B, class C experts essentially. And essentially, unless you were an expert that they can't find a replacement for you in China, they had to prove that they would not give you a visa. And it was very hard for new fresh grads. And this new scheme is completely different, right? It's actually attracting new grads that studied STEM or any kind of technology innovation, whether you're in the technical side or the business side, to kind of come in and actually work within the China ecosystem. So I think that's an interesting shift. I have one last question for you, which is, what is one contrarian or differentiated view you hold? And this could be about the work you do, it could be about the world, it could be about anything.
Yeah, I think it would be actually good to expand on the very last point we discussed in terms of
Mm,
international cooperation. I think we all tend to look at like, how China works with the West and like the US and Europe. And like in many ways, when you talk about science, technology, and innovation, this is where we see like a lot of the challenges emerges as well, because like on both sides, essentially, we see very strong emphasis on national security. But I think one area that people often overlook is China's interaction with the rest of the world. China's science technology cooperation with like a lot of the emerging markets have been growing enormously. Like if you are, going to the universities in Beijing, you see enormous amount of talent coming out from quote unquote the global South countries, coming from Africa, coming from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, and all of them like they study in China for years, and then they bring back these solutions they see or these technologies they see in China, bring back to their countries. And these are the connections that we are only starting to see the emergence of what they all mean, because we are looking at like how these relationships built over like 5, 6, 7 years of PhD life, and these are very strong
mhm.
connections that will last them a lifetime. So we are looking at how they are going to evolve over the next few years, next few decades. In fact, I think that is one area that we see that I think is definitely like underreported, and I would love to actually look into that a bit more.
Anything else you want to touch on or share with us before we wrap up?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation and found it insightful, please follow and subscribe to Differentiate Understanding on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Grace Shao, and I'd be so grateful if you shared an episode with a friend. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.